Right around that time enters Ancel Keys.
Ancel Keys was a pathologist at the University of Minnesota. He got the idea in the 1950s that saturated fat and cholesterol were what caused heart disease.
It strikes without warning. Of 10 men, we can expect 5 to get it. But we can't say who, or when, or why.
Ancel Keys was this incredibly persuasive person. He had a really outsized belief in his own ideas.
The facts are simple. You know the chief killer of Americans is cardiovascular disease, disorders and degeneration of the heart and blood vessels. Here are vital statistics. They show that this problem here in America is the worst in the world.
Ancel Keys was famous for something called the 7-country study. This is where he went and studied 7 different countries and came up with this hypothesis as to how we're supposed to eat based on correlation.
Ancel Keys is the one who proposed what he called the diet-heart hypothesis, and that was that saturated fat and cholesterol, dietary cholesterol, would give you a heart attack, especially saturated fat, like hot oil down a cold stovepipe. It would just clog up your arteries and give you a heart attack.
The problem is he cherry-picked these countries to fit what he was trying to hypothesize. It set out to prove that the more calories you got from fat, the better chance you had of getting heart disease. It seemed like a straight line between the least fat consumed and the most fat consumed, with the U.S. at the top. The only problem is Keys studied 22 countries. And if you factor in all of those countries, the results were all over the place. He just took the 7 countries that proved this point, that fat causes heart disease. This study made Keys the temporary savior of the medical community, and therefore the world.
Such that he was able to get onto the American Heart Association Nutrition Committee, and he turned the whole association around in 1 year and got them in 1961 to recommend that all Americans restrict saturated fat and cholesterol in their diets in order to fight heart disease.
Dietary fat and its relation to heart attacks and strokes. Most persons in the United States who are overweight will find it profitable to reduce their total caloric intake. Reducing the amount of fat in the diet is one way to do this.
This is the first advice anywhere in the world telling people not to eat saturated fat and cholesterol to fight heart attacks. That's like the beginning of it all. That is what just blossomed, bloomed, grew into the giant oak tree of advice that we have now.
We have no credible evidence to say that saturated fat causes heart disease. And that sounds crazy to say when you look at our government guidelines and our dietary guidelines, but there is no high-level, credible evidence to show that saturated fat causes heart disease.
The interesting thing about Keys, he got virtually everything wrong, but it never infected his humility.
Dr. Keys' singling out of excessive consumption of fats as a major factor in coronary disease is by no means accepted by all investigators.
In front of us, day by day, are increasingly more and more very tempting foods.
In the mid-1960s, John Yudkin comes on the scene. He's a British scientist. He thinks sugar's the problem.
When people have heart disease, they don't just have elevated cholesterol. In fact, they often don't have elevated cholesterol. They have a whole cluster of metabolic abnormalities. 10, 15, 20 things you could measure. And Yudkin was saying, if I feed animals sugar or I feed college students that I'm using in my experiments sugar, I could cause pretty much all of these things just by giving them a lot of sugar.
See, up to, say, 200 or 300 years ago, the average consumption of sugar in this country was about 4 pounds a year. And that's splendid. I'd be very happy if everybody ate 4 pounds of sugar a year. They eat 100 pounds.
Comparative studies of the diet of 41 nations have convinced Professor Yudkin that there is an almost exact relationship between the consumption of fat and sugar.
Moreover, many sugar-containing foods, cakes, candies, cookies, chocolate, ice cream, various kinds of puddings also contain fat.
You always eat some fat. So if you eat high-carb foods, you raise your blood glucose, you raise your fat-storing hormone insulin, and you're going to store the fat that you eat. It's all individual how much you can tolerate, but if you eat more than your body can tolerate, then you will most likely gain weight, gain fat.
Drawing the analogy of the relationship between diabetes and national sugar intakes that could statistically also be related to the fat intake, Professor Yudkin considers that heart disease may well be causally related to the consumption of sugar.
And instead of looking at it, Ancel Keys just jumps right on top of it in the media and turns this guy into a nut job.
Keys was really a bully when it came to trying to quash anybody who opposed him.
Ancel Keys wasn't going to let anyone come in and rain on his parade.
He published a 9-page rebuttal in a journal called Atherosclerosis in print. He said Yudkin is a mountain of nonsense.
It is clear that Yudkin has no theoretical basis or experimental evidence to support his claim for a major influence of dietary sucrose in the etiology of heart disease.
Keys and his colleagues managed to paint Yudkin as a quack and to portray Yudkin and his sugar theory as quackery and to say there was absolutely no evidence to support it.
None of what is said here should be taken to mean approval of the common level of sucrose in many diets.
Keys was had more political influence and more savvy maybe than Yudkin, and somehow this dietary, and we were spending money testing the dietary fat hypothesis, so even though the tests weren't confirming it, the more money they spent, the more people were wedded to the hypothesis having to be right.
These studies are extremely expensive, and there have been enough good studies done to support our moderate approach, which is looking at balanced foods, vegetables, fruits, grains, and lean meat and dairy products.
The argument, once again, is it has to be tested. When you believe it's wrong, prima facie, you're not going to spend the money to test it.
Why are these nutrition scientists just not more curious about other ideas? You know, I was at a conference recently where we talked about a low-carb study where they reversed the diagnosis of diabetes it was a large university-based study in just 1 year on a very low-carb diet. And not one of them said, wait, what? Diabetes reversal? Wow, how'd you do that? Can you just explain your study a little bit to us? Because that's what we as nutrition experts, we really need to do in America. And I actually got up to ask a question from the audience. I said, you know, did you hear that? That was 60% reversal of diabetes. Should that not be headline news? And should you not be curious? Why are you not even curious about these ideas?